What I do is I have the students position the mandrel so that the open portion of the mandrel is pointing down. The locking set screw is pointing vertical here. As I slide the mandrel into the yoke here, I rotate it a quarter of a turn clockwise, and what that does, it brings these two mechanisms together so they're locked in place. Then at that point I want to slide the mandrel all the way in and lock it in position. So we have the mandrel in place. We've got fairly good shoes in the mandrel and also the honing stone. What we need to do at this point, I'm going to start out with the roughing stone. The one I have right here is a CR12. That means it's a finishing stone. The roughing stone is a CR10, lower number, more of a coarse stone. So I'm going to slide this into the mandrel, and there's a spring inside the mandrel that holds the stone in place after it's inserted in the mandrel. If I turn that mandrel upside down, that stone doesn't fall out, and that's because of that spring. Okay, I'm going to rotate the mandrel so these honing shoes are pointing vertical. At that point, I'm going to set a connecting rod over the mandrel, and then I'm going to expand the mandrel so I have pressure on this gauge down here. At that point, I'm going to take a little Allen wrench, and I'm going to loosen these 4 Allen head flat-headed screws. Now what this is going to accomplish, it's going to allow these shoes to adjust to the housing bore or the radius of that connecting rod. Just tap the rod a couple of times and it allows these shoes to shake and vibrate a little bit, and they'll contour or settle into that housing board. Next part, this is an important item. When you go to tighten these little flat-headed screws back up, notice which end of the Allen wrench I'm using. Just snug these down. If you do this, you're not going to strip out the Allen head portion and then have to spend a lot of time drilling them out and kind of messing around with that. So that's going to work out fine, just what we did there. Okay, what I'm going to do now is we're going to hone the connecting rods, all 8 of them, 2 at a time, so that all of the connecting rods are around 1/1000 smaller than size. And then we'll switch to the finishing stone and get them right to the exact tolerance. Now notice how I set those 2 connecting rods on the mandrel. I'm really careful about how I hold the connecting rods. I'm going to hold this one in one hand, and notice that I'm right around the housing bore. I'm going to hold the second one right around the housing bore also. And the only reason for me to be here now is to move the connecting rods back and forth over the mandrel, covering the shoes and the stone, somewhere between 1/3 to half the width of one of these connecting rods. That'll help keep these bores straighter. One thing that I caution people that I work with, make sure that you keep away from holding onto the beam. I see people out here holding onto the connecting rods like this or like this, and I think that has a tendency of putting excess pressure. All we need to do is move the connecting rods back and forth. If we keep good tension between the shoes and the stone, the mandrel is going to make the housing bore round, and it's going to keep it straight. So let's get started. I'll start the machine, we'll start the honing process. About every 6 strokes or so, what I'm going to do is take the connecting rods off, I'll check its size, and when I go to put the mandrel or the rod back on the mandrel, I'm going to turn the rods over. I also want to say that for me it works best is once I start the honing process, I keep these 2 cheeks of the connecting rod together all through that honing process. When I'm moving the connecting rods back and forth, this is called overstroking, about 1/2 to 1/3 of the width of one connecting rod. This helps keep the housing bores straighter. Okay, we've got all 8 connecting rods, about 1/1000 small right now, and they're roughed in. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to remove the roughing stone, and I'm going to put this finishing stone in. This is the CR12 stone, and it's going to give you a lot smoother finish. So I'm going to take the first 2 connecting rods that I had up here, and on these first 2 connecting rods, I'm going to hone them so they're 1/1000 small. Then I stop and I measure the housing bore with a micrometer to see if the micrometer agrees with this gauge. If there's any discrepancy, I'm going to believe the micrometer, use the connecting rod to set this gauge for the final size. I'll show you that as we go on through it. By the gauge, this connecting rod reads 6/10,000 smaller than the final size. So what I'm going to do is take the inside micrometer, set it to the inside diameter of this bore, and then I'm going to check that with the outside micrometer. And right now I have 2 inches 2/24 and 5/10. So this gauge is extremely accurate. What I'm going to do now is take this connecting rod, put it back on the gauge, and make sure from my vantage point it reads 5/10,000ths left to come out of that connecting rod. And boy, it's really close. Okay, so at this point now, I can continue honing right to 0. Okay, now I've got all the connecting rods honed to the zero. I think it's extremely important that everybody knows that the process that we've done so far, that you keep the stone, the mandrels, or the stone and the honing shoes tight in those housing bore. I like to watch this gauge, which tells me how much pressure I'm putting on it, and I like to stay up here about 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. It'll decrease as we take material out of the housing bore and also as material sloughs off the stone. But if you hone lightly, it will not give this mandrel a chance to make this housing bore round. The way the mandrel is designed, it's kind of like a triangle. It will take the material out of the vertical diameter, which is the only thing we shrunk. When we cut material off of the parting edges of the cap and the rod, we shrunk the housing bore this way. We did absolutely nothing to shrink it this way. So the mandrel, if you keep it tight, will take material out here, and it won't do anything across the parting edge. So making sure it's good and snug and there's some resistance to the honing is really important. What I'm going to do now, after the rods have cooled a little bit, is I'll take the connecting rods now one at a time, and I will finish them right back to the zero. This is one of the first 2 connecting rods I honed, and for example, it has shrunk about 1.5 ten-thousandths of an inch. So now it's okay to back off the pressure, but remember, up to this point, you got to keep good pressure between the mandrel shoes and the mandrel stone in that housing board. So here we go. Now, as I check the last connecting rod, I'm going to do something a little different here. Right here we have the size we want, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the connecting rod out towards me, away from that faceplate, and I'm going to move the connecting rod back and forth, twisting it, and read the gauge. And what that does is it measures the outer edge of the connecting rod. I want to see if I have the exact same measurement there as I do in the center of the connecting rod. That tells me whether or not I have like a barrel configuration, where it's small on the outer edges, big in the middle, or like an hourglass, where it's large on the outer edges and small in the middle. These rods look fine. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to check the pin end of the connecting rod, so to make sure that it has the proper interference fit with the new piston pins. Now we're going to go ahead and do the pin end of these connecting rods, and in order to do that I need to remove these 3 large gauge point sets. So I'm going to remove those. Now, notice that we've got a black one and we've got a silver one. This is a silver arm, this is a black arm on this side, so they're color coded so you get them in the right spot. The top one that was adjustable always goes upward on the top arm. So I've removed those. Now what we've got are 3 small gauge points that we're going to actually check with this smaller perfect circle to make sure that they're reading directly across the diameter of the housing. Here again, I'm going to expand the gauge points until I get a reading on the dial indicator. And at this point, I'm going to take the little spin type, slide it up through the slot in the bottom, and I'm going to adjust the set screw until I get the largest reading right there. Okay, so now that quickly we have checked and adjusted these small gauge points, so we're going to be able to read the housing bore on the connecting rod. This is the gauge block that we're going to be using to set the diameter for doing the pin into the connecting rod. In order to accomplish that, I need 2 piston pins. I've got 2 new piston pins out of the pistons that we're eventually going to hang on these connecting rods, and I'm going to insert them in this gauge block and tighten them down. Okay, we snug them down with your fingers and then just crack them loose. So what we've done now is we've set the distance between these 2 bars, the exact diameter of each of these piston pins. And now I'm going to set them on the gauge. And all I do is expand the gauge out now to the 0. I'm going to lock the fingers in place, and then by loosening the bezel clamp and adjusting the face of that dial indicator, I can set it exactly at 0. Now what I'm going to be able to do with the connecting rod is simply pick it up. I just hold it, support it with my thumb and forefinger, set it over the gauge points and twist the connecting rod, and I read the needle at its highest point going counterclockwise. So this has 2 thousandths press fit. I can turn the connecting rod around, barely slide it over those gauge points. That tells me I also have 2 thousandths press fit there. Let me do that with one other one here, just to check a couple of them. This has about 2 2/10 of a thousandths press fit. Now if we looked on the face of the machine at this chart, we could read the pin type in the first column. The pin type here is oscillating in the piston press fit in the connecting rod, and it tells us that on an aluminum piston you want to have 3 to 5 10,000ths clearance. If we go over to the third column, it talks about connecting rods oscillating in the piston press fit into the rod. It tells us minus 8 10,000ths to minus 12 10,000ths press fit. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the average of that, which is 1,000ths. We're going to hone these rods to have exactly 1,000ths press fit, and then we'll have the correct interference fit for hanging and then eventually aligning the rods. Now in order to accomplish that, I need to take this mandrel out that I've used to recondition or hone the large end of the connecting rod. I'm going to release the lock, little set screw, remove the mandrel. I'm going to set it over here in its holder. Now to select the proper mandrel for the pin in, this taper gauge works really well. Simply slide it in the bore, and the lines that it's between is 900. So I'm going to select the 900 mandrel here. And notice it has this extra sleeve with it. Okay, this is the 900 mandrel. Now if I simply took it and put it in the yoke here, pretty loose. We need to use this adapter sleeve on it. Okay, the open portion down, slide it into the yoke, rotate it a quarter of a turn, and then slide it all the way in. I'm going to lock it in place. Now, I'm going to slide this the stone out. And I have a new stone here. And if you could get a close-up of that, you can see that it has the letters KL dash and the number 13 on it. That KL13 is the stone that we're going to use to hone these connecting rods. I'm going to slide it in the mandrel, lock it in place. Now this sleeve that you saw was with the mandrel. This is a truing sleeve. And since I'm putting on a new stone, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hone that sleeve just as if it were a connecting rod. And then what that's going to accomplish is it's going to true, straighten out the stone if there's any irregularities in it, and it's also going to straighten out these guide shoes. So here we go. I'm going to do a little adjustment of our fluid flow.